So I've noticed more and more in the Twitch live streams and in the YouTube comments as this channel has grown that a lot of people have been asking about game collecting specifically. As somebody that has spent a lot of time, passion, energy, money into amassing a collection like mine and having it go through various iterations over the years, I've definitely put a lot of thought and effort into what I do, why I do it, motivation for doing it, what I look for when I collect, those kind of things. And I want to discuss today a number of things that I think maybe a lot of collectors want to shy away from a lot of times, or they don't necessarily want to think too hard about. They don't want to be too logical. You know, there is a lot of passion involved in what we do here. On the same token, though, I try to be pretty logical about my approach. And so I want to outline a few different talking points, and I would love to hear what you guys have to think. But without any further ado, let's get into a number of things that I think most collectors don't necessarily want to talk about, but I want to be as open with you guys as possible. So here we go. The first point I'd like to discuss here is budgetary constraints and financial status, essentially. The simple fact that most of us in the game collecting space are not rich. And I think this is something that most people are aware of, but I do remember back in like 2008, 2009, 2010, kind of the early days when the YouTube retro gaming scene was starting to form. There were these channels that did kind of explode in popularity, and many of which are still popular today, many of which have been going for a long time, and I have a lot of respect for. Their collections really were kind of the catalyst. In addition to their knowledge and their passion, I think people saw these large collections and went like, whoa, I want to be that. I want to aspire to that. That's what I want for myself down the line in the future. I can tell because back in the day, I remember seeing so many comments. You'd click on any of these videos where they'd have a background like mine, and so many of the comments would be like, man, this person must be loaded, they must be rich, or their parents are rich, or they have this really cushy job with a bunch of income, or they won the lottery, you know, like any of these kind of theories to explain how somebody could afford, you know, to have 1,000 video games or whatever. But really the simple truth is you just spend a lot of time on this and you set aside money, and it's over the span of years and years and years. And for my own personal anecdote here, this collection behind me, I've probably put about 5 to 6 years into for the most part. I should say that I've been a collector for most of my life, but I've had these phases, these ups and downs, and I have had situations where I have had to sell stuff. Probably the biggest situation was when I went off to college. I sold a vast majority of my collection. Now, I did keep things that meant a lot to me. I think that experience was overall really healthy because it actually had me look at my collection and go like, what do I actually value? What do I want to keep? What do I want to have sitting in my parents' house while I'm off at school collecting dust because I want to have it when I come back and I can actually, you know, get back up on my feet again and have the space for this kind of stuff. That whole process was really important. And ultimately, I've never spent that much money on my games in the grand scheme of things. You know, like I said, this collection here, which is like just over 900 games, this has taken like 5 or 6 years. And some of this stuff, again, I owned before even then. So it's just a matter of time, and it's a matter of, once again, just harnessing that passion and putting some effort toward it and trying to find deals, things of that nature. I'm not rich. This has not happened because I just have a ton of money laying around. This has been a lot of careful buying, careful consideration, looking for deals, collecting things that not everybody wants. Like a lot of the games back here aren't necessarily worth a whole hell of a lot if you go item by item. In fact, if you even calculate what this collection is worth, I easily paid well under half of what price charting would say. So it's not one of those cases where I've just blown a bunch of money on this. Like a lot of this was careful consideration over a long span of time, and I think people don't necessarily realize that, and even collectors don't necessarily mention it as maybe as much as they should. And the next aspect I'd like to talk about is one that I feel like has gotten a lot more traction in recent years in the YouTube gaming space and the physical media space as well. It's that idea that our media has a finite shelf life or a limited use lifespan. That is not to say here that I'm trying to minimize the actual causes for concern here. I think there are instances where these things can happen, and they might happen even if you do everything correctly, but I want to get into that a little bit more as to why that's the case, because I think a lot of people are just starting to assume, well, discs can rot, so like anything could go bad. You never know what might happen. Honestly, I think most discs that are manufactured properly, that are stored in a temperature-controlled environment with no excess moisture and humidity and heat, I think your discs, for the most part, are going to be fine. And if they're not, it's either because you're storing them improperly and they're being exposed to these harsh elements that can speed up the degradation process, or they were just manufactured improperly at the factory. It is totally not uncommon for, especially if you're like me and you've done some like Laserdisc collecting. Laserdiscs are notorious for what they call laser rot, and it's essentially just the Laserdisc version of disc rot. All discs essentially are these sandwiches of different layers, and Laserdiscs are especially bad because it's two plastic layers with a metal reflective layer in the middle, and then in most cases they were just bonded with glue, these two giant plastic layers, and if the glue wasn't very good, that glue could separate, the two halves separate, suddenly you get oxygen in there, you maybe get some moisture, some humidity, and that metal layer will start to oxidize, and essentially you're losing data at that point. A lot of it comes down to improper manufacture as well as improper storage conditions. You need pretty much at least one of those two, and in a lot of cases both, to see any significant horrible effects on your discs. Again, while it can happen, and I'm not going to sit here and say it doesn't, and there are instances of really poorly manufactured discs. One that comes to mind is the Twin Snakes version of Metal Gear Solid on GameCube. Those were notoriously poorly pressed, and even if you store them properly, they can go bad, and they're notorious for that. It can happen, but it's usually much more of a case-by-case basis, and it's pretty low probability, especially in our lifetimes. Like, I am not worried about the vast majority of the games behind me going bad before I won't be here to notice them go bad. The third aspect of collecting that I feel like a lot of collectors maybe want not to think about or wish they didn't have to think about is the space concerns. And if you can tell behind me, you can probably tell there's not a whole lot of empty space. I've done a pretty good job of managing to fill about every nook and cranny here. That being said, I'm pretty much out of shelf space. I do have a little bit of space beyond the camera on the back wall, where I could probably fit another shelf. I just haven't yet. But yeah, I'm starting to run out of space. It does make me a little more selective about what I actually want to pick up. It also means that I do actually have a lot of games kind of in stacks in other places, and it's definitely less organized than I would like it to be. I've also got games that either I got duplicates of, or I've played and I've decided I don't really need to keep in my collection. I don't plan on playing them again. Or games I've just acquired that I really have no interest in continuing to own, and I've got a whole stack of those waiting to get traded in. So space is definitely a problem when it comes to game collecting, and I wish I had some sort of better solution, but in the grand scheme of things, I do think it is a good issue to have. Once again, it really makes you think about what you want to have in your collection, what matters to you, what you want to keep, what is worthy of space in the limited space that maybe you have. Obviously, different collectors have different amounts of space to work with. I don't have a ton. Hopefully in the future that'll change, but it does get me really thinking about what matters to me most, and I think it's a good restriction to have. And the last element I'd like to touch upon here might be the most divisive and the most inflammatory and incendiary, but I feel like it does need to be said. It's just the simple fact that, especially now in 2024, honestly, having a lot of this is kind of unnecessary. And I'm not trying to say that there's no reason, but I think just if we're looking to play a lot of these games, you don't need to own all this. You know, I think most people are understanding of that. I think if you collect on a certain level, you're not doing it just because you want the ability to play the games. You want the original experience with the original hardware. Maybe you want to have put some money into that game so that you're more likely to put more time into it, right? I think there is a little bit of psychology there as well. In reality, like, especially the earlier consoles, like, there's no reason really to own Atari 2600 games or NES games, Genesis games, Super Nintendo. Pretty much all those consoles can be emulated almost perfectly, right? We are past the era of janky, poorly running emulation. In 2024 and beyond, a lot of these systems can run without a hitch on an emulator, and you probably wouldn't even notice the difference. I get a lot of questions on Twitch like, hey, are you emulating? I do find it interesting how often that question gets asked, because in the grand scheme of things, you shouldn't be able to tell a difference if the emulator is running properly. Now, that being said, I did end up getting really into PS2 and Xbox collecting, because when I was getting back into those 4 or 5 years ago, it was hard to emulate a lot of those games. I'd run into some pretty major issues on things like PCSX2. OG Xbox, ironically, even though people call it like a PC in a box, the emulation scene for that was like just starting back then. It has come a long way since then, and I'm sure it will continue to develop quite nicely. Even those consoles are getting easier to emulate, and I think we'll get to a point where you really don't need to own the original hardware anymore and keep that stuff around in order to just be able to play these games, which is ultimately what matters. But obviously, everybody's got their reasons for collecting. I think just playing the game is one small part of it, but I do also think a collector with a sane mind should be able to admit, do I need it? Absolutely not. This is for fun, right? We do this because we love it. Ultimately, that's what matters. We want to have things in our collections that matter to us, that mean a lot to us, that hold places in our heart, and ultimately that's what it's all about. So guys, that's it. Thank you for checking out this video and watching. I would love to hear your guys' comments on some of the points that I brought up throughout the video. Please consider subscribing and liking the video. It helps out the algorithm a lot and gets this content out to more people. Thank you guys for watching, and see you all soon. Do I need it? Absolutely not. This is for fun, right? We do this because we love it.